G'day there, you're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today I'm covering a topic that's been relatively requested by some of the users on my channel, which is actually my journey through BIM management, how I got there, some important lessons I learned along the way, and some things that might help you if you're seeking to become a BIM manager or a BIM coordinator or a similar role as well. So like I said, quite a few of you have asked me this question, so I think it's important that I put this video together to help give you a better idea. So I'd like to say that everything I express here is my own opinion and from my personal experience. Nothing I say here reflects on the companies I've worked at, even though I may mention companies here and there that I've had the opportunity to work at. Every company I've worked at's taught me something valuable along the way, and I've never left a company with any ill or bad feelings about what I went through. So just noting that. So what's this all about? So it's my career journey so far, all the way from high school through to where I am right now. Some key lessons that I've learned along the way and applied, so some life choices that have sort of been driven by these decisions, and also just some suggestions for you of how my life lessons might impart upon you as well. So the main 3 points that I'm going to keep calling on in this video is that everything I've done that's been worth doing has been a risk. It's never been a safe or an easy choice. If it's an easy choice, it's typically been something that hasn't developed my career that much. If it's a risk, it has. I found that the best teacher in my life has been experience. It's hard to do something very well if you cram it in a short amount of time, or if you try to get taught by a course. I notice there's a lot of educational courses for BIM management going around these days, like degrees. From what I notice, these don't tend to give people the same experience that project and life experience will give you instead. So be patient. And the last point is that clothes don't make the man. So even if you have a degree, without that experience, it's quite often quite obvious to other people that maybe you don't have the right experience to do a job. Anyway, back to the start. So I actually grew up in Adelaide in South Australia, the capital city. It's a little bit smaller than my current hometown of Sydney, but this is it here. So essentially it's just a standard metropolitan city in Australia. Great place to grow up, had a great time here, went to school here, had friends. This is me in high school. Bloody terrible hair, I've got to say. I actually decided to be an architect in year 10. So I really enjoyed physics, mathematics, and art. And this seemed like the most common combination of those three subjects in a career path. My mum actually helped me decide, and I pretty much was set on it since year 10. I'd never heard of BIM, and I'd never heard of CAD. I really didn't know fully what an architect did at this time. So I went to university at University of South Australia. So this is one of the buildings I studied in. A lot of the buildings there were actually by a well-known architect in Australia called John Wardle. So it was great to have some exposure to some of those more modern styles, which sort of influenced my style as well. I mostly used AutoCAD, 3ds Max, and a bit of SketchUp at university, and a fourth product that kept a few of them going that some people might recognize. This was my final studio, so obviously very design focused, very evocative, very intense, so very different from what you tend to do in the real world as well. It's very different from what I do now. As a BIM manager, it doesn't really relate to what I do, but just interesting to see where I started. So I didn't actually use Revit at all at university. I didn't use it until I started working professionally, because Revit was actually discouraged by a lot of lecturers and tutors, not only at my university but at most of them, because there was a perception that if you used Revit, your designs would become too simple, too stagnant, and to be honest, this is sort of true. If you don't really know how to use Revit, your designs rely very heavily on what comes out of the box. So it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but I wasn't really ready for the real world in terms of what programs I knew. This is me when I studied. I studied all the way through bachelor's and master's for 5 years. No gap years, no breaks. I wanted to get out in the working world as fast as I could, start making money and start gaining experience. So in 2012, I started looking for my first job. I'd had a little bit of work experience, but not too much. So I was almost riding on no experience. I applied to about 50 firms. Nearly every firm I could find in Adelaide, I applied to. I heard back from just 5. So to give you an idea of just the the amount of jobs going around at the time, there wasn't that many. Adelaide's a quiet city sometimes, and work was a little bit quiet at this point. And I actually only got an interview with one company out of the 50 I applied to. So that's a 2% success rate, even just getting an interview. And I wasn't successful in the interview, mainly because I didn't know how to use Revit, which was quite ironic. But we'd just been coming out of the slump from the global financial crisis. So my market was really feeling it. But I got a lucky break. So this is where I started off my career in 2012 as a BIM technician. So this was my first lucky break in my career that really defined where my career went. So I actually met a friend who was working on a project with Design Inc. And they set up an interview for me just through me knowing them. So I was very fortunate. It was just pure luck. It was actually this project here, the new Royal Adelaide Hospital. So this was the biggest BIM project in the Southern Hemisphere at the time, valued at about $2.2 billion. It was immense. It was amazing to work on this project. Nothing I've ever done in my career has been like this since. It was between Design Inc. and Silver Thomas Hanley as a joint venture. And I worked on this project for about 3 to 4 years. So I actually had to take a Revit examination when I joined this company. This is before I actually got the job as well. This is quite common in companies, I find, that need to screen people to make sure that they have the skills that they say they have. I was pretty honest. I said I'd barely used Revit, but they still wanted to test me anyway, and I failed my test miserably. So as sad as it is to believe, the Aussie BIM guru failed his first Revit test. So we all start somewhere. But the BIM manager was a very kind person. He was an interesting man, and he actually gave me a second chance. He just said, you know what, we can teach you. We can see that you're enthusiastic and you want to learn. And I got given the chance, which was very lucky. So I actually got to sit next to the BIM manager on the project for about the first 2 or 3 months. And I learned so much about auditing and cleaning models and what a good model is, what a good standard is. This BIM manager was pivotal in how I evolved as a BIM manager. It heavily influenced how I look at BIM models and what a good, well-managed model is. So I can't thank him enough for what he did for me, even if I was typically lighting models on fire more often than not. But over time I realized that I really liked BIM. Whilst architecture was great, BIM was a whole nother ballgame. I couldn't believe just how diverse it was. So yep, that's pretty good. I actually was in a project office with about 80 architects, mostly using Revit, even most of the senior ones. So it was an amazing environment. I actually ended up forming into a hybrid role eventually, half BIM Technician, half BIM Coordinator, because there was actually a really large Navisworks model they used to clash dissect the project. And luckily enough, I was assigned to work with the lady that was managing this, who I got to work with as a mentor of sorts. And eventually she moved on to another team, and I was left to sort of help run the clash dissection process. And this really taught me about just how to use BIM as a coordination tool. I was very lucky. It was a huge model to coordinate. Obviously, there was about 30 different models put together just for the architecture alone. But it was such an amazing opportunity. And this is just a public release image I found here of the Navisworks model, I believe, when the project was complete. Eventually, the project moved to Siteface, and I didn't really have any site experience. They had a lot of people, so they had to let some people go. So it wasn't really a bad thing, it was expected. But luckily, Design Inc., who I was working for, actually offered me to move into their Adelaide office and start working on some defense projects, which was brilliant. So I was rehired as a BIM coordinator, as I would call it. It was called a BIM Model Manager, but essentially I was really coordinating their BIM internally. So doing a lot of model audits, developing content, and developing standards. So I was working in the Adelaide office with about 30 architects, and again, most of them were using Revit, so that was great. The best choice I ever made in my entire career was while I was here in this phase of my career. I started to learn Revit outside of the office. I learnt it in my downtime, spent a lot of time on it. I spent hours. I would have spent more time probably doing this at some points than my actual job outside of my work hours. So I actually picked my university project as a project to build in Revit from scratch. So I took a Revit template and I purged it, I cleaned it, I got everything out of it until there was nothing left. And then I forced myself to rebuild a Revit project. So I learned how to build everything, even things like elevation markers and section heads and dimension styles. They were purged out, so I had to rebuild them. So I learned everything really. So I did things like set up proper documentation of the model as well. This is just all done by myself. So the title block, all the text, the annotations, all done by myself. All the line weights were set up by myself. So it was a great learning experience. I really went into detail on what I did. You can see just the amount of consideration I put into the elements in the model and the cleanliness of how it all looked, and also the constructability of what I was putting in the model as well. So it was a great learning experience, and it taught me so much about Revit. Highly recommend everyone should do this if they want to become a BIM manager, so you know the program inside out. I even did things like set up a fully schedulable facade panel system, which we'd probably never actually do in the real world, but it taught me a lot about data management and scheduling and sorting out parameters. It was very valuable. And I also set up some systems too. So I was taking lessons from the big project I'd worked on and trying to replicate some of those systems in my own way. So sorting views and sheets and using naming conventions to keep things in order, which have really influenced my standards today. And that was the outcome in the end. So it was a really successful project. So I even finished up by looking at materials and rendering. So really valuable. I guess once I really got to the top of my learning curve here, people started to notice. There were really people noticing I was starting to specialize very heavily in the use of Revit and doing some quite advanced things with it for the time. And people began to take notice, in particular, one of the managers in Sydney. So my second lucky break is that actually the Sydney office, which was operating as a separate part of the designing franchise, offered to hire me as their office BIM manager. A huge opportunity, and it was exactly what I wanted. Of course, I accepted it, and I took the risk, because if you don't take the risk, you lose the chance, and I was not going to lose this chance. So it was a big change. I actually moved to Sydney from Adelaide. I moved out of home, and I moved states at the same time. So my first apartment wasn't in my home state. So it was a big change. This is me just before I got on the plane. So yeah, I jumped over from Adelaide to Sydney, and Sydney is incredible. I love living here and working here. I'm so glad I did it. I don't think I'll move anytime soon. This city has so much opportunity. I highly recommend anyone to consider working here, especially if they're in BIM. So yeah, I moved to Sydney. So I stepped up. Time to become a BIM manager. So I sort of leapfrogged the BIM coordinator role to get there. But it was a lot of luck and a lot of risk. So I was working in the Sydney office with about 50 architects, mostly using Revit, a little bit of AutoCAD, but mostly Revit. The first thing I did when I came in the office is I actually knocked over my drink on my keyboard. So just to show you how young and awkward and inexperienced of a BIM manager I was, this was probably a good sign for other people. But I guess I rehauled a lot of the office standards. So I rebuilt most of their content. I gave them a whole new parameter system, templates, I rehauled their BIM management plan. I used a lot of new mediums that I hadn't used before. So I actually conducted office training, one-on-one training, reporting up to managers, delegating model managers, and authoring standards to keep it all together. So it was a huge opportunity, and I learned a lot about how I work. But I was young, and I actually lacked a lot of experience. I hadn't worked on that many projects yet. I hadn't worked with that many types of people, and I was very new to the Sydney market. So I had to be pretty honest with myself. So I remember the clothes don't make the man. So just because I go to work in a suit doesn't necessarily mean I have the experience to fill my shoes. So back I go, back a step. I decided to step away from the BIM management role for a while and try out the BIM coordinator role. So I actually worked back on projects as a BIM model manager because I'd really missed this step in my career for the most part, especially in Sydney. So I actually worked at HDR and then Woods Bagot as a BIM model manager or a BIM coordinator. So both of these were Sydney based. There was about 50 to 100 architects in both companies respectively. And they used a mixture of Revit, a little bit of ArchiCAD here and there, and a bit of Rhino. So I was more exposed to different ways of working and into operating. So I worked on a commercial tower at Woods Bagot called 2 Melbourne Quarter. and then I also worked on a rural hospital upgrade in Dubbo at HDR. And these two projects essentially allowed me to operate as the lead BIM Model Manager. So it was sort of like a self-contained BIM manager who had a team to work with and technicians to manage and stay on top of, and models to remain on top of as well. And they were complex projects, so they taught me a lot. So I gained a lot more experience in projects coordination and working with engineers, project managers, clients, etc., which I hadn't really had before. I got exposure to the bigger picture as well, so I understood the Sydney market a lot better, which is really important in a BIM management role, to understand your market. And I also understood company politics a bit better and how to navigate it. I made some mistakes here and there, nothing major, but I learned, to keep a cool head, which I didn't always do before that. I was a bit of a hothead when I was younger. I learned a lot about humility as well, because I took a step back. I took a pay cut in one of my moves by choice. I just said, listen, this is the right move, so I don't mind if I'm not going to be paid as much, and I didn't. And I also gained empathy for other people that I worked with, because I wasn't managing them anymore. I was working with them. I was in the trenches. I was sympathizing with their struggles, and I was helping them through them, and they were helping me too. So I learned a lot about teamwork. And I guess above all, I grew up, I matured as an individual, as a man, which was really necessary. And I don't think I would have got this experience if I just stayed in a management role. Because, like I said, I became more humble, and I think this was essential for me to reapproach the role of a BIM manager with a fresh take and a new personal outlook as well. So I guess I'm reinforcing that experience is the best teacher. If I'd went and got a degree in BIM management now, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now, I'm sure of it. So I returned to form. In 2019, I was lucky enough to be approached and enter a discussion with a company to become a BIM manager again, which was very fortunate. And essentially I became the BIM manager at Kron Architects for the better part of a year and a half. So during my time here, I had a whole different way to approach BIM management available to me. I was in a Sydney office, just over 30 architects, using Revit and a little bit of Rhino. And this time I felt ready. I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew how I wanted to do it, and I'd learnt from my experiences from my first attempt at being a BIM manager. So rather than rehaul standards, I tried to improve them instead. There was already another BIM manager there that I worked quite closely with, and over time I sort of gained their trust in order to improve the systems rather than replace them. I learned that sometimes you need to respect what's in a company and develop it instead. As well as that, rather than guessing in situations I wasn't familiar with, I was now prepared. I drew on experience in nearly every scenario. As well as that, rather than just work on my own as a lone wolf, which I usually did before, I decided to build a network, both through LinkedIn and in person, and I started engaging in some presentations in Sydney as well at some of the user groups. I also learned Dynamo and Grasshopper, so I got very interested in computational design, which actually led me to begin the Aussie BIM Guru, my YouTube channel, which you're watching right now. I actually started that in March of 2019. So that was a really big change to how I approached BIM and my career. And I guess from here, I'm actually stepping out into a left field sort of job. So I've actually become a BIM specialist now in the bigger spectrum. So only really from the start of this year. So my revelation when I was a BIM manager again is that I didn't want to just improve one company. My channel showed me that I wanted to help more people. So one company just wasn't my passion anymore. My passion was to reach as many people as possible and to help people for a living as part of my job. So I guess, again, I'm taking a big risk. I'm taking a chance, and I think it's going to pay off. I think a lot of you are really supporting me already to do this, so I feel very supported and very comfortable. But again, I'm taking a risk. So my risk is that I am becoming a BIM consultant. I guess by the time you watch this, I probably already am. But at the time of this video, I'm setting up my business, BIM Guru. So this is, I guess, my current position in where I am. So if you're after any guidance in developing your career or making the next step, feel free to reach out to me, because I do actually talk to a lot of people about these sorts of things. Sometimes people just ask me, oh, I'm studying this, should I consider, getting a degree in BIM, or should I look at becoming a BIM coordinator? What would you suggest? Or I'm just trying to improve the standards of my office, and maybe someone's not being paid to be a BIM manager, but they want to be. How would you go about negotiating that with the company? More than happy to help you. But hopefully my journey sort of helps show you, I guess, the route that I took, and I guess that a lot of it was built on chances and luck and other people's generosity. So thanks for watching, and remember that don't rush. I think experience is the key to any job, and being confident with the solutions you deliver. So hopefully that sort of resounds through my career journey. So thanks for watching today. If you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so. I make videos about 2 times a week and hope to do so for a while. So thanks for watching today, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.